The various modes of the negative attitude of consciousness, the attitude of skepticism, and that of theoretical and practical idealism, are inferior shapes compared with that of pure insight and its diffusion, of the Enlightenment. For pure insight is born of the substance of spirit, knows the pure self of consciousness to be absolute, and enters into dispute with the pure consciousness of the absolute essence of all reality. Since faith and insight are the same pure consciousness, but as regards form are opposed, the essence is for faith mere thought, not notion, and is therefore the sheer opposite of self-consciousness. Whereas for pure insight, the essence is the self. Their nature is such that each is for the other the sheer negative of it. In their appearance as mutually opposed, all content falls to faith, for each moment, in its tranquil element of thought, obtains an enduring being. Pure insight, however, is in the first instance devoid of content and is rather the pure vanishing of it. But by the negative movement towards what is negative to it, it will realize itself and give itself a content. With paragraph 541, we now begin a subsection of this Enlightenment subsection, and this one is the longer one. It is called the struggle of the Enlightenment with superstition, and superstition is how faith is going to be framed. As we've seen, pure insight and faith are related to each other in an almost fraternal rivalry. They cannot escape from each other. And pure insight is going to have to frame faith in a way that, in a certain sense, is alien to faith, but is also coming out of faith. It's very well worth keeping in mind if you haven't read much in, say, Christian thought, whether in early Christianity or in medieval Christianity, you will see a lot of discussions of the difference between what is viewed as genuine faith or genuine religion and superstition, on the other hand. Christianity originally framed itself in opposition, as did Judaism, to other religious attitudes or religious perspectives. And in a certain sense, it's been talked about as the demythologizing religion. Now, the Enlightenment is going to turn that against faith itself, and specifically Christian faith, by construing that as also being a mode of superstition. Before we get to that, we have to see what Hegel is starting out with here. And he's going to draw a very important contrast. As so often, when he begins, he likes to look back over how far we have come and what we have been looking at that resembled what we're engaging with now. And when it comes to this, as he's calling it, negative attitude, which is what pure insight at first is going to be, a negative attitude, there are several different things that he says we've already passed through, and they were important, you might say going up the ladder, to use one of the metaphors that a commentator of Hegel, who some people keep mentioning to me, brings up, this notion of a ladder. What are the ones that he discusses? So we have skepticism, which you may remember from the self-consciousness section. It succeeded Stoicism and the dialectic of master and slave and the struggle to the death. And it precedes the unhappy consciousness, which is where we see a religious attitude taking shape. There, the religious attitude is happening after. It is the dialectical advance past skepticism. It's not one that actually succeeds the unhappy consciousness, but it is one nonetheless that leads us somewhere. So Hegel's saying, listen, this is similar to what is going on in skepticism, but it's not exactly the same. Then he brings up, and this is very interesting, theoretical and practical idealism. Now, of course, Hegel is himself an idealist, but not idealists are all on the same page with each other. Just because, say, Berkeley is an idealist, or, according to Kant, Descartes is an idealist, does not mean that Hegel sees things the same way that they do. And it may in fact strike you as something a bit strange to talk about practical idealism. And that's something we should linger over for just a moment. But first, what is he actually talking about? Well, what went on in the reason section? If you remember, we began that section, which corresponded historically at the beginning to, we might say, the Renaissance and the revival of science in the modern period. He said that reason realized that everything is for it, that everything is for consciousness, that in theory at least, everything out there in the world is knowable, understandable. That is one way of understanding idealism, in the way that the philosophy means it, not in the sense of, pie in the sky, starry-eyed, devotion to some sort of cause. Even practical idealism isn't that. It's not just the sitting back and not engaging with the real world. Practical idealism for Hegel, as we saw in the other parts of the reason section, once we got past the physiognomy and phrenology, and we're focusing on the human being, and we're looking at how it is that human beings actually try to realize what we saw as the Sache selbst, the project, the essential thing, and attain some sort of recognition of who they are and what they are in the process. That is practical idealism. So all these things like virtue in the way of the world, or the law of the heart and frenzy of self-conceit, or reason giving itself laws and even discovering laws, all of that was what he's calling practical idealism. That is important, but that has also been surpassed. So he tells us that what's different here? He says, these are inferior shapes. These are inferior forms. That doesn't mean that they're terrible. It just means that they've been surpassed. Compared with that of pure insight and its diffusion, the Enlightenment. Pure insight is born of the substance of spirit and knows the pure self of consciousness to be absolute, and enters into dispute with the pure consciousness of the absolute essence of all reality. Now, it enters into dispute with what? Faith. It doesn't just enter into dispute with culture, with the political system, with values. It enters into conflict with faith, because faith itself is something very important for Hegel. Faith is a mode of pure consciousness that is thought. It's not just a feeling. It's not just a set of propositions or something like that. It is a shape of consciousness for Hegel. So he says, since faith and insight are the same pure self-consciousness, as regards form, they're opposed. For the essence is for faith mere thought, not notion. So the Enlightenment, the diffusion of pure insight, is in significant part an attempt to take what over here is mere thought, which isn't, bad by itself, and turn it into notion, turn it into begriff, turn it into something that is genuinely self-conscious, as well as conscious of something other than it. So he says, the thought of faith is the sheer opposite of self-consciousness. But pure insight, the essence is the self. Their nature is such that each is for the other the sheer negative of it, he says. So he talks about an opposition here. It says, in their appearances mutually opposed. As they come on the scene, historically as mutually opposed, and as the Enlightenment starts to gain ground, he says, all content falls to faith. Faith has a wealth of content, as we're going to see in the next paragraph. But that content is going to be critiqued. It's going to be attacked from the position of the negative. And really, no defense that it can mount is really going to save it from that, because the negative you can find everywhere. So he says, each moment in its tranquil element of thought obtains an enduring being. Pure insight, however, is in the first instance devoid of content, and is rather the pure vanishing of it. It takes content and it chews it up and it digests it. And when it's done, there's nothing left over. So he says, now here's where it gets really important. By the negative movement towards what is negative to it, it will realize itself and give itself a content. Pure insight, if it were just pure insight by itself, it would be something like skepticism. Because it is this movement of the Enlightenment within culture, it is going to attain a content. And this is a very important point. It knows that faith is opposed to pure insight, opposed to reason and truth, just as it sees faith in general to be a tissue of superstitions, prejudices, and errors, so it further sees the consciousness of this content organized into a realm of error, in which false insight, common to the mass of people, is immediate, naive, and unreflective. But also it has within it the moment of reflection into self or of self-consciousness separated from its naivete in the shape of an insight which remains independently in the background and an evil intention by which the general mass of the people is befooled. The masses are the victims of the deception of a priesthood which in its envious conceit holds itself to be the sole possessor of insight and pursues its own selfish ends as well. At the same time, it conspires with despotism, which as the synthetic, non-notional unity of the real and this ideal realm, a curiously inconsistent entity, stands above the bad insight of the multitude and the bad intentions of the priests, and yet unites both within itself. From the stupidity and confusion of the people brought about by the trickery of priestcraft despotism, which despises both, draws for itself the advantage of undisturbed domination and the fulfillment of its desires and caprices, but is itself at the same time this same dullness of insight, the same superstition and error. In paragraph 542, Hegel is sketching out for us the way that the Enlightenment, and indeed pure insight, historically, construes faith on its side. And there's a number of different important elements to this. You notice that there's a sort of tripartite association or dynamic that Hegel is going to pick out and talk about here, and in the coming paragraphs involving despotism, a priesthood, and a rather stupid and ignorant and gullible people. This is not what Hegel himself is saying. This is what Hegel is saying the Enlightenment says about social dynamics and the entire social sphere. This is what he's saying the Enlightenment engages in as its critique of religious institutions and, associated with them, political institutions and, you might say, a lack of education or formation, a lack of culture on the part of the ordinary person. So he says, pure insight knows that faith is opposed to it. Opposed, he says, to reason and truth, which pure insight is arrogating to itself and saying, we are the ones who actually are exercising reason. We are the ones who actually do have truth. Even if we don't have a content for that truth yet, we at least are the ones who are seeking truth rather than claiming that we have truth. And he says it construes faith as a tissue of superstitions, prejudices, and errors. And then he says, going beyond this, it doesn't just view the person of faith as, this isolated individual who's gotten things wrong but could be led back to the right way. No, it infects the entirety of society. And you might say, if we adopt a historical point of view, it represents a history of errors prior to its own advent, the advent of the Enlightenment. So he says it sees the consciousness of this content organized into a realm of error. And notice what he's going to say here. Very, very important point. In which false insight. It's not just that faith has something to teach and that people uncritically, without questioning it, assume it. I mean, that's not even really the case in medieval times and ancient times anyway. There's always people who are saying, well, wait a second, what about this? But put all that aside. Let's say we go with this caricature. Faith goes beyond that because it presents itself as providing insight. You might think, for example, of the difference between faith and philosophy, or religion and philosophy, or theology and philosophy. Notice that you can substitute all these terms in there because they all get muddled up together when we look at the history of this. It's very common in histories of philosophy to say that, with Thomas Aquinas, we finally had a strong distinction between theology and philosophy. That's actually bunk as far as history of ideas goes. The history is actually much more complicated. Rather, there were constant border crossings, and sometimes they weren't even sure that the border was there. The medievals talked about the philosophy of St. Benedict to mean the monastic rule and the way of living. Christian philosophy was understood in a number of different ways. And with the Enlightenment, we have people saying, that's not philosophy, that's not reason, that's just whatever it is that you happen to believe, gussying itself up within the trappings of rationality. Rationality falls on this side. So it's really within the modern period that we find a rigid distinction between philosophy and faith starting to be developed, at least on the side of philosophy. There certainly was one on the side of faith. You think about Peter Damian, who saw philosophy as a tool of the devil, but he also saw grammar that way as well. And those people are at the extreme, at least in the West. So going back to this, a realm of error in which false insight, and he says, common to the mass of the people, not just the intellectuals, the people think that they have insight. And they're totally wrong about this. Again, Enlightenment viewpoint. Hegel himself is not actually saying this, although Hegel would have no problem saying it for different reasons. It's the Enlightenment philosophers who are saying the people are stupid. The people don't know anything. The people are just sort of an inert mass, or even worse, once they start getting ideas, the ideas that they have are really cockamamie. So he goes on and he says, this false insight is immediate, naive, and unreflective. And so we have, say, for example, religious devotions. People saying, I saw Mary, or, the rise of affective spirituality. All of these sorts of things that we can point to if we know the history of ideas and where it coincides with religious practices. Which, by the way, is not that distant from Hegel. Again, remember, Hegel is writing at a time when the Enlightenment, in a certain sense, is over, but in a certain sense hasn't already seen itself through to the end. He's part of an Enlightenment, a second Enlightenment, we might say. So, going on, he says, the masses are the victims of the deception, here we get the second term, of a priesthood, which in its envious conceit holds itself to be the sole possessor of insight and pursues its own selfish ends as well. So we have the institution of a religious hierarchy and a whole set of orders. We might think of, in medieval Europe, priests, monks, nuns, bishops, all sorts of auxiliaries that we don't really have around too much today, except in very special churches like canons and all of that. And they're teaching the people, but they're deceiving them. And they're doing it to their own benefit, but they're also doing it because they themselves are deceived about their own role. And they're teaching the people superstition. The people themselves already have plenty of superstition going for them, but the priests shape it. The priests modify it. So we might think, for example, of how Christianity ended up taking over Europe and replacing the various pagan customs. We see, for example, Gregory the Great telling, I think it's Augustine, this is mentioned in Bede's History of England, that the pagan temples should be, instead of being destroyed, rededicate them to the true God, right? And so you can take the superstitions of the people already there and turn them around, make them serve some sort of Christian purposes, make them serve the faith. Now, Hegel says that, the Enlightenment sees this as the realm of error spreading itself. So he says, here we go. The The masses are the victim of a deception of the priesthood. At the same time, this priesthood conspires with a despotism, a political rule, right? We might think of kings. We might think of whoever happens to be in charge in feudal Europe or in early modern Europe. We have all these principalities spread throughout Germany and Italy and some other places as well. Even in organized nation states like rising Great Britain or France or Spain, you do have these nobles who are in charge, and they work hand in hand with the priesthood. The priesthood helps to keep the peasants and the city dwellers in line. Despotism allows rule over them. It works out very well for both. So he says it conspires with this despotism, which as the synthetic, non-notional unity of the real and this ideal realm, the despotism. What is he talking about there? Something like, kings and other people being seen as, in some way, divine, right? You could think of what happened in the Protestant Reformation. Already the kings had a semi-divine status before that. When Henry VIII makes the king the head of the church, that in a certain way consolidates these religious energies that are available, particularly through the closing of the monasteries and taking over all of these dimenses and domains. So he says this is a curiously inconsistent entity, and it stands above the bad insight of the multitude and the bad intentions of the priests, and yet unites both within itself. So we're talking about despotism being able to, in a certain way, harness faith, and now we're talking about state power again, right? So what goes on? He says, from the stupidity and confusion of the people brought about by the trickery of priesthood, despotism, now notice this, which despises both, draws for itself the advantage of undisturbed domination and the fulfillment of its desires and caprices, but it is itself at the same time the same dullness of insight, the same superstition and error. That is everything the Enlightenment is supposed to be fighting against. Those are the three key things. Stupid, superstitious people, grafting, greedy, hypocritical priests, and a despotism which looks on all of this and says, you stupid fools, I can use you now to enforce a kind of social order that's going to work out for me. I'm not really the defender of the faith, and I'm not really the warden of the people, but I'll treat myself as such so long as you're going to keep calling me that. That is what the Enlightenment opposes itself to and views as opposed to it. The Enlightenment does not attack these three aspects of the enemy without making a distinction. For since its essence is pure insight, what is universal in and for itself, its true relation to the other extreme is that in which it concerns itself with a common and identical element in both. The aspect of individuality, isolating itself from the general naive consciousness, is its antithesis, which it cannot directly affect. The will of the deceiving priesthood and of the oppressive despot is therefore not directly the object of its activity. Its object is the insight devoid of will, which has no separable individuality of its own, the notion of rational self-consciousness, which has its existence in the general mass, but is not yet present there qua notion. Pure insight, however, in delivering this honest insight and its essentially naive nature from prejudices and errors, wrests from the hands of the bad intention the reality and power of its deceit, for whose realm the naive consciousness of the general mass of the people provides its basis and material, that is, the being for self of that realm, has its substance in the simple, naive consciousness as such. Hegel begins paragraph 543, now having identified these three aspects of the enemy, by saying that the Enlightenment does not attack these or engage in critique without making a distinction. What is the distinction? Is he talking about distinguishing between them? Saying, well, the despotism is something different than the priesthood, is something different than the superstitious people, so we have to adopt, say, different modes of attack for each of those. That is not what he is actually saying here. He's talking about something different, which is going to be isolating out a common element. Not just a common element to each of these, but a common element between pure insight and the entire realm of faith, this tissue of superstitions, errors, and deceptions. So he says, because its essence is pure insight, what is universal in and for itself, its true relation to the other extreme is that in which it concerns itself with a common and identical element in both. What is common and identical in both of these? Here he talks about individuality. So we have the universal as involving the individual. And we've seen that, that there really is no absolute contradiction between these in Hegelian dialectics. How is that going to play itself out here? He says that the aspect of individuality isolating itself from the general naive consciousness is its antithesis, which it cannot directly affect. So we're not going to be looking at just individuality per se, the individuality of a contingent being. He says, the will of the deceiving priesthood and of the oppressive despot is therefore not directly the object of its activity. In a way, these are individuals, right? The despot, you can appeal to them as an individual, or you can critique them as an individual. The king is a jerk, right? This priest is engaging in these hypocritical practices. Look how deceptive they are. I mean, imagine if the internet had been around and cameras at the time of the Enlightenment. We'd have all these revelations be going on of how terrible everybody is the way we do today. So he says that's not what the Enlightenment is actually going to focus on. I mean, it will actually focus on that a lot, but that's not where the thrust, the critical strength of it lies. He says the object is the insight devoid of will, which has no separable individuality of its own, the notion of rational self-consciousness, which has its existence in the general mass, but is not yet present there qua notion. Everybody on this side is also rational self-consciousness, but they're not behaving rationally in a self-conscious way. You might say that they're employing what should be rational self-consciousness in a way that is irrational. They're using their rationality to deny that rationality. They are being less self-conscious than they ought to be. If we wanted to frame this in terms of freedom, which he's not talking about here, but would make a sense to talk about it, we could say they're using their freedom to throw away their freedom. And this is a point of history where that could, in fact, be changed, not just for particular individuals, not just get rid of this despot and bring in a new boss, not just, call out the bad priests and have some devout ones in there, but rather change across the board. So he says, pure insight, in delivering this honest insight and its essentially naive nature from prejudices and errors, it's deriving this from over here, this essentially naive nature, taking it away, rests from the hands of the bad intention, the reality and power of its deceit. What does that mean? It rests from the hands of the bad intention. The bad intention was on the part of the priests. The reality and power of its deceit. It's offering an alternative. It's satisfying the naive consciousness, which otherwise would be listening to the priesthood, with something better. He says, for whose realm the naive consciousness of the general mass of the people provides its basis and material. The being for self of that realm has its substance in the simple naive consciousness as such. The Enlightenment is going to be appealing to the common man, to the ordinary person, and saying, listen, the stuff that these guys are telling you, if you really look at it, doesn't actually make sense now, does it? Let's apply reason here. That is at the core of what Enlightenment critique is about.